Hello and welcome back to Lab 19 using vSphere High Availability. This is part 3 where we're going to add hosts to the lab cluster. So a couple things that need to be said about that is some of the vSphere High Availability prerequisites. So let's take a look at those prerequisites in terms of the topology. First of all your hosts must be licensed for vSphere High Availability, and High Availability actually comes with almost all versions of vSphere. So you can just check that online and you can find out which ones are available for that. The cluster also must contain at least 2 hosts, and we can see that we do have that here. We have ESXi1 and ESXi2. All hosts must be configured with static IP addresses. So if we use DHCP, we just have to ensure that the addresses persist across reboots, meaning that might have those addresses reserved in the DHCP scope. Essentially, we just want to make sure the address does not change. All hosts must have at least one management network in common. We ensured that, so we set up a management network and made sure that both hosts were connected to that in the previous lab. Let's take a look at that. Here we are looking at ESXi1, and we see that yes, it is currently connected to the management network. It's also connected to the vMotion network. And then if we take a look at ESXi2, we can also see that that is in fact connected to the management network and the vMotion network. And if we take a look at the topology, we can see that here is 172.16.1.0. That is our management network. And then if we take a look over here, we have 172.16.20.0, and that is our vMotion network. Next, we're taking a look at the requirements for a common data store. And so we can see that both ESXi1 and ESXi2 are connected to that iSCSI LUN0 data store that we defined as the common data store for our hosts in our cluster. They also must be connected to the same virtual machine networks, which we didn't take a look at previously, but if you take a look here, if we take a look in here at our virtual switch connections from our ESXi hosts, we can see that we have the VM network here, and we're currently connected to that. And you can see that a whole variety of virtual machines are connected to that, including a virtual machine that we had used to create a ESXi host. And if we take a look at ESXi2, we can also see that it is currently connected to that VM network, although there are no virtual machines on that switch. Okay. Next, if we wanted to perform virtual machine monitoring in our cluster, we would have to ensure that VMware tools are installed on the virtual machines themselves. Now, here we are taking a look at student VM01, and we can see that under VMware tools, although the virtual machine is not running, we can see that the VMware tools are installed. Here's VM02, not running, and tools not installed. And here's test VM01. Not installed. So if we wanted to provide virtual machine monitoring currently, we could do it for 01, 02, not for 02 or test VM01. We could take a look at this one here. That also does not have those VMware tools installed. Okay. Last item. Only vSphere high availability clusters that contain ESXi6 hosts can be used to enable VMCP. So our hosts themselves would have to have ESXi6 installed on them. So if we take a look here, we can see that ESXi1 in fact does have vSphere 6, and ESXi2 also has vSphere 6. So this ensures that they are compatible for the vSphere high availability clusters. That's specifically if we wanted to enable VMCP. Clustering is actually available on lower versions or earlier versions of ESXi, but it's the VMCP enablement which we'll be looking at later on. Okay, so now that we've reviewed the requirements, let's move on to adding the host to the lab cluster. We have the two ESXi hosts, which we're going to be adding to the cluster. It's pretty easy to do that. It's the configuration portion that becomes fairly significant. So once we add those to the cluster, and we can do that by dragging and dropping, we're going to need to go in and modify the cluster settings so that we have the appropriate ones. So we'll be selecting that cluster and then ensuring that we turn on vSphere high availability and that we manage admission control like we did in the previous activity when we actually created a cluster. We'll be taking a look again at the admission control and the failover capacity reservations, as well as data store heart beating and so forth. So we'll be doing that next. Okay, so we've exposed the host and cluster tab and we've selected the lab cluster. And so the next step after highlighting that is we can simply click, drag, and drop our hosts on that lab cluster. And when we expand the lab cluster, you should be able to see, I guess we might have to refresh that. All of our objects, hosts, and virtual machines showing in that lab cluster. Another way to do this is to select the lab cluster, right click on it, and click Move Host into Cluster. And you'll see there's only one left, so we'll go ahead and select that one and hit the OK. And that will move all of our objects now. We have both our hosts and all the virtual machines that are currently being hosted on ESXi1 in the same cluster. And we can see that those actions were indeed performed over here. So we've moved both hosts into the cluster at this stage. Now we're going to right-click that lab cluster and select Settings. So I'll go ahead and close that up, make it a little easier to view. And after right-clicking, hit Settings. And then in the Settings, under the Manage tab, we want to select vSphere High Availability. Okay. And so you can see currently vSphere High Availability is turned off. We get a little review here. Talks about host monitoring and VM component protection, which I mentioned earlier. So if I don't talk about it in the context of the lab itself, I'll mention something about it in there. And then the virtual machine monitoring, which we mentioned earlier, requires the VMware tools, etc. So this gives you quite a little bit of information. So let's go ahead and turn on the host monitoring because it's currently turned off. So that means I need to hit my edit button here. And this brings up the lab cluster edit cluster settings window. And notice that we have two options in here, the vSphere High DRS, distributed resource scheduling, and the vSphere High Availability. That is the one we currently want, so we will enable that with just a click there. Once we've clicked that, we can see that host monitoring currently is turned on. And if you take a look here, it explains what that is. All the ESXi hosts in this cluster will be exchanging network heartbeats. By disabling this feature, we can do that when we're performing network maintenance. That would prevent isolation responses, meaning shifting of virtual machine workloads when a host is not detected. So if we disable host monitoring at the cluster level, then heart beating will be disabled, network heartbeats, and so therefore if I take down say an ESXi host, then that doesn't trigger the master host to shift virtual machines thinking that, oh, you know what, we lost a host. It might be that we just brought that host down temporarily and we already took care of the virtual machines, or it could be, in fact, what we're doing is we're doing some maintenance on that and we didn't actually take it down. It's still on the network. We've just changed perhaps some networking features on there like ports groups and things like that. Okay. Let's go down to the mission control here. So you can see in mission control, we can go ahead and click on that. And that'll expand the mission control section. And so I'll need to scroll down to expand all of that there. And so we can see that we have some choices to make. The default for mission control would be reserve failover capacity for a single host, meaning that we'd actually have to hold back the total capacity of a host and not assign that. So that way if a host fails, we have the capacity of a host available. When we say capacity, we're talking about its resources, its CPU and its memory, etc. We only have 2 hosts in our cluster, so that this would prevent us from actually doing any adding any additional virtual machines, etc., because we've already we're going to be setting aside a whole host's worth of capacity. So we don't want to do that. So we want to change this to reserving by percentage of the cluster resources. Notice that it's set at 25%. And let's talk about that for a moment. Okay, so if you recall up here, if we define this by static number of hosts, this really defines how many host failures the cluster is going to support. So if we have this enabled, it says that we can support 1 host failure, and then after that, we won't be able to add any more virtual machines to our environment. We won't be able to deploy any additional virtual machines. If we click on this one, what we're really saying is the percentage of CPU and memory to be reserved as spare capacity. So what we're essentially doing is we're holding aside 25% of the total CPU capacity and 25% of the memory. So we'll take a look at that later on. So that means that this is going to control any new deployments of virtual machines. If we get to that limit where we've used 75% of our capacity, let's say, we wouldn't be able to deploy a new virtual machine. Okay, let's take a look at data store for heart beating. So we'll go ahead and click to expand that and then scroll down to expose that section. So high availability uses data stores to monitor the hosts and our virtual machines when the management network has failed. So vCenter server is selects 2 data stores for each host using the policy and data store preferences list specified below. So we're going to use data stores from the specified list and complement automatically if needed. But basically, we're going to choose our 2 data stores, NFS Volume 1 and iSCSI LUN 0. So in the event that a host is perceived to be no longer available because network heartbeats are not being received by the master host, then the master host is going to check against these data stores to see if the host has been heartbeating to the data store, meaning accessing a small file that's on there and updating the timestamp on that. So we'll click OK to save this. Oh, and by the way, if we take a look down here, we can see the host mounting selected data store. Both of those are. So we'll click the OK. And we can see that it is now turned on. High availability is now turned on. And let's go ahead and expand our lab cluster over here. And we can see that we have 2 of our hosts are available. And we're going to run out of time on this video, but we're going to right click our student VM01 and power that on. And right click student VM02 and power that on. And we'll get a little warning message on those. So I'll go ahead and select student VM01. And as usual, we'll get this little warning message that we need to answer this question here. We've seen this before. And our answer to that is generally going to be that we copied it. And we just hit the OK. And then if I hit student VM02 and do the same thing and hit the OK, and then on the next video we can come back and take a look at some more stuff. If we go to the lab cluster in the inventory and select that, and then under monitor, and then select vSphere high availability, we get a summary here, and it shows us how many hosts, shows us our master, excuse me,